Oh, hello everybody. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Jack Cruz. For those that don't know, Dr. Jack Cruz is a brilliant doctor. His ideologies and ideas around light, hacking your environment for better health, and his whole work is so amazing and interesting. And I do suggest for anybody that does not know who Dr. Jack Cruz is to go and look him up, watch all of his podcasts and materials. He has a forum and websites. So Dr. Jack Cruz, thank you for being part of this interview.
No problem.
All right, so the first questions will be about genetics. Genetics is a topic that fascinates me and my viewers, so I'd like to ask you about it. Dr. Jack Cruz, you are a very intelligent man. You have a very high cognitive ability. Do you think that, for example, parents that want to have children, can they do things to make sure that their child will have at least average or above average cognitive abilities? Are there things they can do, or is it purely genetics and there's nothing they can change about it?
Very interesting question to start with. I would tell you that your question carries some cognitive biases in it that you seem to carry, and probably 99% of other people seem to also carry, because you view genetics as the be all end all of the lens
Mm,
of what life is. And I would tell you that you have to understand that I don't look at that. So to be very, I don't want to say controversial, but I do want to point out something that the guys that founded DNA, which were Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin, even though she wasn't credited with their, she was probably the more important person.
mhm,
One of the interesting things, that James Watson was canceled about this very question that you brought up. He spoke very candidly at one point about his assessment regarding the black-white difference in IQ. And his conclusion was that this was the part of the story, and he believed that it was shared by the majority of the specialists, when he said this in the mid 1990s. This was right when the Human Genome Project was coming out, but the implications of what the Human Genome Project found were not really well known. What happened to Watson? He was probably, if you think about it from cultural standpoint, he was probably the first OG molecular biologist that was canceled by cancel culture because of this issue. And I think if you look at his history and his legacy, that he wanted to live long enough so that he could have his remarks vindicated, so that he would not be looked unfavorably as his last act of science going out tied, to the question you brought up. Now, the interesting part of the story for me, this is where I blow your cognitive bias up and I introduce you to the other partner of DNA, Francis Crick. In 1999, when I was already finished with my training, he made a really interesting comment that was really tied to the Human Genome Project, but it dealt with the organ that I'm an expert in as a neurosurgeon. He believed that the next requirement for the brain was to be able to find out how true firing worked in more types of neurons, both in an on and off and rapid manner in an animal that's alive, specifically us. And he made the comment in 1999, I think it was in Nature magazine, in a comment, that he believed that the ideal signal would be light. Now, remember, light is not a genetic phenomenon, is it? It's an epigenetic phenomenon,
epigenetic, yeah.
right? And then he made the comment in 1999 that he said, I think this seems rather far-fetched based on what conventional centralized science was at that time. But he
Mm.
believed that it was conceivable that molecular biologists would have to eventually engineer a cell that could be sensitive to light to see if it in fact happened. Literally, not even 3-4 years after he made the comment, we had scientists actually starting to find out about optogenetics, where actually light does change fiber type. So my answer to your question is there's no question that parents can do things, but it's not a genetic issue. It's an epigenetic issue. And what does that mean for this discussion that we're going to go down? Probably it means that the nuclear genome is a lens for light, and that light comes from the mitochondrial genome. That's the genome we need to be talking about. That's the genome that we haven't spent any time talking about since the Human Genome Project. In fact, I'm going to tell you since Watson and Crick. Why? Because fundamentally, no one understands what Crick really said in 1999. That is light that controls everything in us. And when you talk about IQ, whether you want to believe IQ is a function of the brain, or as I believe, it's a function of light, water, and magnetism as it operates within the neural circuitry,
Mm-hmm.
because I believe IQ is fundamentally tied to how quantum coherent those things are in you. They are
Mm-hmm.
modifiable, just like all epigenetic things are. But anybody who spends their time thinking that it's the nuclear DNA or RNA, to be quite frank with you, I don't want to have a discussion with them because I think the science of epigenetics has already blown that idea out of the water. And I think Crick was far smarter than Watson was. And I think the fact that science canceled Watson and has nothing to say about Crick or Rosalind Franklin leaves the door wide open for guys like me and Robert Becker. And I
Yes.
think the ongoing battle right now with me is between me, Michael Levin, and some of the young quantum biologists who I vehemently push back about some of the work that's being done in their labs. Why? Because I don't think it goes far enough. And to answer your question, I think
Yes.
the only way we answer it is we are going to have to find out what the effect of light is on IQ. And one thing that we do know, when you put the human brain in around natural light, it reacts much better. It makes more connections and it appears to be wiser and smarter. So
Mm.
those metrics are tied to IQ. Now, is IQ the be all end all? No. But I've famously said, and I think you probably know this since you probably listened to a lot of my interviews, the Watson and Crick idea is neo-Darwinism, where survival of the fittest is the option. I believe the science of epigenetics and your question pulls back the wizard, and this is why I say I believe it's no longer survival of the fittest. I believe it's survival of the
The
wisest.
wisest. Mhm.
So again, definitively, parents can change it, but guess what? If you want to fix your children, you have to fix your germ cells where your children come from first. And if you don't do that work, you have no
Mm.
hope of creating wisdom in children, which is truly the artificial intelligence that we all should be paying attention to.
Yeah, so the things that parents can do to fix their children could be basically living closer to nature and in sync with the cycles of nature, in sync with the temperature, with the light. Is
Well,
this what you
remember
mean?
the three things that control the circadian mechanism in all of life. It's not just us, the three domains of life, which are prokaryotes, archaea, and eukaryotes, all respond to the same thing. They just have more primitive or less feedback loops to control it.
Mm.
It's light, water, and magnetism. So, what are the three key issues? Why is life fully decentralized? Light doesn't control it totally. Darkness is also a part, and then temperature is. Those are the three things that the circadian clock mechanism pays attention to, especially for photo repair, but also to optimize, systems. And we've had this argument that goes way back, even before Watson and Crick. And I would tell you to really get to the essence, if this is what your tribe wants to understand, I think they all need to read Schrodinger's book in 1944, which is pre Watson and Crick science. And he asked a simple question: what is life? And Schrodinger, argued from a physics perspective. But remember, he didn't have any of, how shall I say, the cognitive bias that we just talked about Watson and Crick. And he made some very interesting statements in that book. Now, he didn't have the science to add like the muscles, the ligaments, to the skeleton argument that he put there. But his central question in that book was, how does life achieve the living state at a physical level, and what principles govern it, to the best of our ability to understand, so that it can persist and evolve. And when you actually think about that issue, you have to break life down into three parts: the beginning, probably, which we would call birth and the origin of order. And then I think the middle part of life, which is the journey of mitochondrial sculpting. And then probably the most interesting part that nobody tends to talk about is the omega, which is light at death and the release of order back into the environment, to return entropy from which it came. And when you understand that light is the fundamental driver, but it can't work without the other pieces and parts in the gearbox, so to speak, then you begin to understand that life is complex, but what drives the complexity is life cannot happen unless you have supreme control of the atomic molecular organization of atoms in crystals that are in cells. And that was what actually Schrodinger talked about in the book. Even in 1944, he thought that life had to be an aperiodic crystal. And most people in biology didn't know what he meant at that time. But remember, he was one of the original physicists who played a role in developing quantum mechanics, even though he did not all the time believe, the things that he was not only discovering, but also proving. And this is what one of the most amazing things about science is, that you can have brilliant scientists who find new things out, but they don't even understand what they just found out. And that's an interesting part of Schrodinger's work. But I would also tell you, I think I'm very mindful in my own work. Could I be making the same mistake that Schrodinger made in the 1944 book? I believe it's possible. Some of the speculations that I've put out into the world in the last 20 years, I don't have any illusions that some of them may prove to be true, but I will tell you this. I'm very confident in telling you that the key for the nuclear genome and the mitochondrial genome is they act as lenses. There are two different lenses, just like you have a lens in the eye. The first part is the cornea. The second part is actually the lens. And what do? They focus the light so that the light can do something that we don't anticipate. And you have to have both of them working. The other way I like to describe it, to give you another analogy, is use computers. Everybody knows you have a hardware computer. Is the computer functional without software? The answer is no. So you think about the epigenome or light like the software. You think about the nuclear genome like the computer. So right now we have a focus in centralized medicine that it's all about the computer and very little about the software. And that is the reason why I'm very confident that in the next 50 to 100 years, you're going to find out that the output of the software is the single most important thing for the nuclear genome. And it turns out, what's the major output? I think when you look from centralized biology, you open up a biochemistry book, you realize that we take nutrients in and we basically turn it into water and CO2. But there's another thing that quantum biology started to find in 1960s through today, that metabolism makes ultra weak biophotons. In other words, we make light. And it turns out the light that we make inside is far more important than even the sun that shines above us. But here's the crazy part. You can't make the light inside of you without the sun coming on you. So this means that the environment, just as I answered your first question, I told you, and you correctly understood what I said, because you said, Jack, is it as simple as we need to tell parents that they need to reconnect with nature before they have children so that they can optimally epigenetically program the stem cells in their testicles and their ovaries before they have children? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
But before people will do that, they have to understand the process that you and I are beginning to talk about. Like, what is the process of the organization of life at its genesis? Many people you'll talk to have many ideas about this. The religious people will look to text. Some people will look at the roof of the Sistine Chapel and say, I'd like to see this through Michelangelo's eyes. And me, of course, I like to be provocative. I tell everybody, go to the Sistine Chapel. And if you want to find out where biophysics is, it's between the finger of Adam and God in the center panel of the Sistine Chapel. That small little white piece of plaster where the fingers don't touch, that's where quantum biology is. All of life is between those two fingers. And what have I told you before about what Crick said? He told molecular biologists in 1999, I think the type of light that our cells emit is going to turn out to be the biggest story, in the next chapter of what centralized science finds. And that's precisely what I'm telling you today.
I agree with you because the vast majority of people in the centralized medicine world, or even some decentralized medicine world, they all believe that genetics are the most important factor, and there is nothing people can do, like parents, there is nothing they can do to maybe make sure that their children do not have cognitive disabilities. But I
Well,
disagree on that because,
but I think the
yes,
reason for that is because the centralized paradigm is set in place by corporations tied to big pharma who want you to believe that. Because
yeah,
what do they create sales funnels, for their products,
mm,
so they never get to the truth. Because if you never get to the truth, you basically be a customer for them the rest of your life. And if you
for the
don't
rest,
believe me, guys your age right now, 50% worldwide are infertile. Now, when you understand that, you go, wait a minute, that doesn't sound really good. And it turns out most of the modern technocracy is why people are infertile. Most of it is tied to the light that we use to communicate. That is not well accepted by the centralized paradigm, but it's not accepted for one reason. Because if you actually went down the rabbit hole and saw it, you would understand why fertility clinics are packed, why people are doing IVF. And when you really take it out to the nth degree, I mean, you think about some of the thing like the transhumanists like Elon Musk are saying right now on Twitter. He's saying we need to have replacement costs for humans, and we don't in many countries. And he's correct. But the real question is why? And he doesn't want you even to get to the why thing, because if you do, you won't buy Tesla cars. You certainly won't support SpaceX because
yes,
everything that he supports actually is tied to the transhumanist technocracy that, him, Peter Thiel, and, many of the people tied to Epstein and Israel and the United States, especially in intelligence agencies, they have fostered, since the 1950s. And this is the reason why most economies have been retooled towards technocracy. What we need to do is we need to let people understand that I believe you can still use technology and still have fertility, but we have to be smarter at what we do. And the only way we can be smarter and have more intelligence about this is that you have to understand the decentralized process of actually how life really forms and exists. And to me, that answer is wholly tied to quantum biology. And if you don't understand the quantum biology, then you have no hope of fixing the biggest problems that people are trying to fix, like in Maha or in longevity or things like that. I think we are so far off the mark because we're looking under the wrong stones. But I also think it's done by design. And the cool thing about the world that we live in now, since we're connected through a decentralized app like the internet, is that we can have discussions like this where you can critically analyze what I'm saying, compare it to what the transhumanists and the tech guys are saying, and then compare it to centralized science, and then understand that many of the people in centralized science are actually controlled by the people who are in the technocracy. And when you understand that, you go, okay, so can I believe everything I'm hearing here? And maybe this guy who's a neurosurgeon who sounds crazy when I listen to a lot of his tweets or this and that, is there some truth to what he's saying? And why is he saying what he's saying? And I think when you give due diligence to both centralized and decentralized process thinking using first principle thinking, I'd be honest with you, I think that's the biggest first step to improving IQ of children. because their parents are stupid fucks. That's the truth.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with you. Your message is absolutely important for, I'd say, humanity as a whole, and that's the reason why I wanted to have you on this interview. I wanted to spread your message, especially to a audience, because most of my audience are younger people, but they never get this message. They are addicted to technology chronically online, and they are never outside, and it's a big issue. Following up on the question about genetics, I would also like to ask you about bone structure. Do you think it is tied to genetics and nutrition or to something else? What's your opinion about bone
Uh,
structure, malocclusions, and physical degeneration?
well, I think that's also a pretty complicated question, but I would tell you, I would take you back to a 1951 and 52 paper written
Mm-hmm.
by Alan Turing. Alan Turing proposed a mathematical basis for morphogenesis. I believe he described what nature's doing, but do I believe that it's light, water, and magnetism that truly sets morphology? Yeah. And I think the reason why I'm pretty hardcore about that is because of what Robert O. Becker found in his work on regeneration in the 1950s and 60s. We now know that when you change photobioelectric signals into a petri dish of cells, we can change the morphology. And the interesting thing is it's not just tied to cells in a petri dish. We can actually change what organs look like when we change photobioelectric signaling. We know that from Becker's work, but we also even know it from Levin's work now. But we also have evidence from the geologic record. There's a guy named Peter Unger, who has done some pretty famous things with primate skulls and human skulls. And he found back when humans were less involved with the technocracy, and we're talking about, the people that built the pyramids, the Nubian people who were found buried next to the Great Sphinx, when their skulls were pulled up, the morphology of their skulls were perfect. The outer and inner cortex of their skulls were absolutely perfect. Then we can compare that to the Egyptian pharaohs, who were the elite class. They have all the diseases that modern man has. And what did they do? They lived a life of
Inside. Yeah.
outside of nature, inside the temples, being
Yeah.
waited on hand and foot. And when you actually see that, you begin to understand that the story of morphology also is the story that I brought to you about IQ, that it actually is the connection to nature, the connection and the quantum coherence that's required to make morphologic decisions. And do I think morphology has a lot to do with evolutionary biology? Yeah, I think it has a tremendous amount to do it. But do I also think that's modifiable by epigenetic factors? No question about it.
I started to believe that skull, especially skull and the bone structure of the human beings, are mainly may be modified and degenerated because of food. After that, I saw
Yeah,
Pottinger
I
cat
don't believe
study,
that. I don't believe that at all. I can tell you where the idea started. It started with Western Price.
Western Apras. Yeah,
Remember, he was a dentist,
yeah.
in the early 20th century. And, people know that I used to be a dentist. I did a pretty famous talk to the Western A. Price Foundation in Vermont in 2016, where I basically told them that if Weston A. Price was alive today and he read my work, he would be a mitochondriac and he wouldn't be following Sally Fallon's bullshit science that
Mm.
food controls these things. And one of the points that I made to them there is that the basis of the entire food web is photosynthesis. It's light. It's not what you think. And then I think the big thing that really stunned them all, I said, I want you to go pick up Western A. Price's book and look at every page. Do you know what you see? You see people that lived outside. They ate outside. They lived outside. There was no electric power grid in any of his pictures. But you want to know something?
Mm.
Weston A. Price didn't realize that. He focused on the things that he understood. And that's what modern humans do too. That's why you have the belief you have, that you believe that food can modify morphology. I'm not going to tell you that it's impossible. I mean, let's face it, we all know that we can get cretinism in humans if they're missing key things around the T3 hormone. But we also know that T3 is predominantly generated. What's the kinetic prompt? It's sunlight. It's not, the food that's in there, but we have the belief that food is that kinetic prompt, and it's not. It turns out they have to work in unison. But when you look at a hierarchy, what's most important? It's always light,
Light,
because,
yeah.
because the reason why you have no food without light. That's the fact of photosynthesis that no one in the Western A. Price Foundation can refute. In fact, anybody who tries to refute it now, you're looked at as a moron, because it's true. But I pointed this out first to the paleo guys, then the carnivore guys, and then the Western A. Price guys. And ever since that time, those guys keep having their food fights and looking like a bunch of idiots, instead of understanding what I've been trying to say from the beginning, that
Yeah.
photosynthesis predated mitochondrial biology. And these are two systems that are completely congruent. I always make the analogy that it's like a spider on a mirror. When you see that photosynthesis is completely reversed by mitochondrial biology, you got to start asking yourself some questions. Why did nature choose to do this? Why was light the kinetic prompt to get cells to do things that they needed to do? Because this is fundamentally the question you've asked me again. And see, I'd like to take all your precepts, your centralized ideas, and take them apart piece by piece using first principle thinking. Why? Because when you begin to see my perspective, whether you agree with me or not is immaterial, you begin to understand why I say light is the first kinetic prompt to morphogenesis. And I think if
Mm.
you read Turing's paper in 51 and 52, he actually is saying the same thing, that mathematics determines how this happens. When you understand that mathematics can never explain nature, but it describes it, he's basically describing exactly what ultra weak biophotons do inside of cells to get them to go from a state of chaos to organization. And what determines that? The science, that's quantum mechanics. Now we're back at Schrodinger. We're back at Einstein. We're back at
Mm.
Niels Bohr. Notice that we're not back at the Krebs cycle. We're not back at the urea cycle. We're not back at the biochemistry book. Why? Because biochemistry is not a fundamental science. Physics is.
If we want to get to the truth, we have to do the same as you do and look first principle, look at the source. And yeah, actually I started to really get interested with your work when I visited northern African countries, and their food was basically very nutrition deficient, but these people, they live more than 100 years. And the thing that they do is not about food. They eat lentils and bread and all types of
All
nutritionally
the
deficient
all the
food.
hey, all the thing that the carnivore guys tell you is bad for you, but yet, why can people in Africa get away with it? Well, guess what?
Exactly, yeah.
Now you just proved my point.
Mm,
That's the greater point that I'm trying to make to people, is that light is the kinetic prompt that
yes.
starts life. And I will take this. Remember what we said earlier about, you know, the genesis of life. What you've just described is a fractal, and I want you to think about it this way, because I think this will be a very unique way to frame the current discussion around food. Let's think about the alpha moment of conception. What do we know from first principles to be true right now? Well, there's a burst of biophotons, ultra weak photon emissions. That's what UPEs are. And that marks the genesis of life. And, early embryonic development in humans, those studies have shown that when a sperm meets an egg, zinc sparks the trigger of calcium waves. And that is accompanied by biophoton emissions that kickstart mitochondrial redox activity. So, where do most of the biophotons are made in a cell? It turns out it's the mitochondria where metabolism occurs. So the first light is that light kinetic prompt that I talked about from the two
Mm,
cells coming together when they release energy to start the process. And it turns out that light is done to get cells out of their stem cell slumber, in the male testicle or the female ovary. And remember, the egg is formed when the baby is actually inside the mother, but really in the grandmother. So this egg has been around a really long time. And it turns out it's a seed of photons that initiates the decentralized synthesis of life. So when you actually think about that, then you take the next step that we learn from the alpha moment of conception, mitochondria are the cellular powerhouses. I don't think anybody in centralized science would argue that. But what does it do? It tells us that mitochondria begin to sculpt energy. They use ATP, which also is a centralized idea, to create some order. And what is produced? I told you the end part of mitochondrial metabolism from foods, whether it's lentils, crappy food, fake food in the United States, or good food, in European places. The end is it makes CO2 and water. And it turns out the water mitochondria make is very special. It's deuterium depleted water, and it's made at cytochrome C oxidase. And how does this all tie back to Schrodinger's book? We seem to feed on negative entropy from light and oxygen. That's exactly what Schrodinger actually proposed in his book, but he was not able to figure that out. Why? Because literally the Krebs cycle wasn't even, figured out in 1944. So in my decentralized thesis, which you said you've read about and you've heard on many podcasts, this tells you that my belief, I align when photosynthesis first began on Earth. When do we know that is? It's during the Great Oxygenation Event. That's a period on Earth's history, 2.4 billion years, where life evolved to harness light and oxygen, creating order from chaos. And it used mitochondria to do it. And it turns out, what's the emission? The emission was biophoton emission. It was light again, which mimics what you see in photosynthesis, which mimics what I just told you happens at the alpha moment of conception. In other words, you're seeing nature's fractal over and over and over again. And it turns out that UP emission, being light, actually answers Schrodinger's initial question. It answers Western A. Price's initial question. The problem is it doesn't satisfy what you've been taught. It doesn't satisfy most of the people that will listen to this podcast, what they've been taught either. I know because I, like you, learned the same thing. Remember, I was a product of the centralized system. You
Yes.
can't go be a doctor in the United States without learning all these things. But here's the beautiful thing about the human brain. You can take something for granted, and it can become part of your cognitive bias, or the frontal lobes in humans, they give you the benefit of
Of the
taking
doves.
something that you don't believe and thinking about it in a more deep fashion than someone else thought about it. And, I told you my eureka moment with Western A. Price wasn't that big. I mean, I looked through the book just like you did. And instead of reading all his beliefs in the words, I kept looking at the pictures and I'm like, what do I see here that's different than the modern world today? Everybody was outside. Everybody was, breaking bread and eating things. And, your comment as, a kid that knows a lot about Africa, you're like, yeah, we eat shit over here. But guess what? We don't suffer from poor longevity. We have super centenarians here too. So then you have to ask yourself the question, if you know that you have super centenarians that eat like shit, then is food really the driver? Was Weston A. Price really telling you the truth? And then when you answer that question for yourself, the next question I need you to look at, what was the original first principle idea? It's light. It comes back to light. It always does. And then you have to say, okay, well, how does light do this? That to me, if you want to know the truth, that is the coolest question that science needs to study, but they don't. Physics tends to study it when it turns to stars, but we don't study it when it comes to mitochondria. And that is the reason why, going back to your first question, I have such a huge problem with my government spending so much money in the NIH on nuclear DNA. Why? Because to get to the light story, you have to understand the mitochondria. You have to understand its 37 genes. You have to understand the 11 that form the inner mitochondrial membrane. That's the story of where biophotons come from. And why did nature build it this way? It's very simple. In the Great Oxygenation Event, what was the key factor? Oxygen. We were anoxic. For the first two domains of life, we had no oxygen. Okay, that's the reason why we have anaerobic bacteria. Because remember, bacteria and archaea were the first two domains. We don't come until 650 million years ago. Okay, and we came because the first two domains joined together in endosymbiosis. Okay, so when you think about two domains that can't handle oxygen, but they spent 2.4 billion years in an oxygen that had three variables: varying UV light, varying oxygenation, and varying temperature. That's what happens in the great oxygenation event. So it turns out you need to look for evidence of why that matters in us. And the funny thing is, you're going to find the oxygenation story is buried in heme proteins, it's buried in melanin. But here's the big one: hypoxia induced factor 1 alpha. Do you know that links directly to the circadian mechanism of man in the peer genes, peer 1 and peer 2? So when you start to see this, you go, wait a minute. Maybe this story that we learned in centralized biology, none of this stuff in biology is fundamental. Everything is actually tied to the physics, and we need to start to understand really what Mother Nature was doing in evolution. She was actually playing with physics to build a chemistry set in order to create negative entropy so that we could do the things we do. And maybe the most important part of the story begins in the 2.4 billion years before photosynthesis, before mitochondrial respiration. Because how can you hope to understand photosynthesis or mitochondrial respiration if you don't know what came before it?
Yeah, you have to think about what came before, because that's the origin story of mammals
Correct.
and human beings.
You got it. And see, that's the reason why I brought the question to you. I'm not trying to be an asshole with you. I'm trying to be provocative so that you and your audience think about what I said about the alpha conception moment, because we know that we're eukaryotes, and we also know the way bacteria and archaea divide is radically different than we do it. But you have to understand, when you understand where we come from, you begin to ask these questions, because they're all first principle based questions. And what does first principle really mean? Do I need to have a randomized control trial prove to you what I said? No. Why? Because we already know it exists. So for example, people that will listen to this, they may be shocked to say, I didn't know that mitochondria make light. I had no idea. Now that it makes light, then you say to yourself, okay, and this is axiomatically true, and it's been proven since 1927, but yet you don't know anything about it. Then you got to ask yourself, okay, why is that? And then once you figure that out, then you go, okay, so what does it do? Let's think about this. What does it do? Well, that's the question right now that should have been asked for the last 120 years. But you know who buried that? Rockefeller medicine. Centralized medicine don't want you to know that, because they want you to believe, take the drug, not use nature. Like, they want you not to explain what you found in your people in Northern Africa. They can eat shit on a shingle, but yet can still live longer than most people in the Western world.
Yeah.
And even if it's not everybody that does this, the fact that anybody lives that long tells you you need to answer the question. That means there's something about these people that is, and here's the crazy thing. We have the same effect in New York City. There's a guy named Nir Barzilai, a Jewish guy. He's at Albert Einstein, and he did the most amazing study, and it flies in the face of a lot of modern science. You know that all the guys that are longevity experts in the US, they tell you that you eat good, you exercise, you live long, right? You know, there's no study that actually proves that. That's just what they tell you.
Yeah.
And then what does Nir Barzilai find? He finds out that the largest group of super centenarians in the United States, that's what he studies, 477. Do you know what they all have in common? Most of them are overweight. Many of them have diabetes. They have BMIs above 30. So let me ask you a question, because I know you're a young man. No matter where you live, when you see people above the age of 75, do they look like Michelangelo's David, or do they look?
No. They have a lot of fat most of the time. Yeah.
Okay, now let's do another hard stop. Let's go back to the fractal that we talked about earlier. You have two eyes in your head. I know you're not a dumb guy. When a baby comes out of the mother's vagina, does the baby talk?
No.
No. Is the baby fat?
Yes.
Does the baby have an immature brain? Yes.
Yeah, he has an immature brain. Yeah.
So guess what? Might it be that the baby uses the fat to build the brain postnatally? And might it be the fractal that you're seeing As we
mm,
get old, we're reversing the same project because as the brain gets older, maybe you need more fat to fix the brain because that's
mm,
exactly what happened in the first 6 years of life.
mm.
Might that be something that's important? Is that what Neo Barzilai is finding? And why is David Sinclair and Aubrey de Grey blocking us from that information? Could it be that they're being funded by the people who are enemy of the people? And it turns out when you look deep enough, you find out it's the same people, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds in the banking cartel, who don't want you to understand what you found out already from looking at your people. They eat
Mm.
lentils, figs, rice, all the things that everybody tells me they shouldn't eat, yet they look pretty good. They're able to
Yes.
live to 80, 90, 100 years old. So getting back to your original questions, IQ, morphology, skeletal issues, all of them are
Mm.
controlled not by the things you believe, by the epigenetics that are there. And the better job you do connecting with nature, my belief is the longer life, healthy life that you can do without touching my profession.
My grandfather, for example, when I look at his picture, he had a very wide jaw. His food, the food that he ate, was basically whatever they could get. Figs, as you said, raw milk, whatever they could get. But it was not anything special. The food was not the issue. The issue was that he was outside most of the time. My father was less outside most of the time because he was studying. My grandfather did not study, but my father had a narrower skull. And then there is me, and I have like the narrowest skull between the three of us, which is generation after generation. And for people that did not figure this out yet, I'd say, look at your grandfathers, people that live very long life, and you could ask them these questions. And yeah, if you ask them, it's not about food, it's mostly about lifestyle and being connected to nature. So it completely makes sense.
Well, I think it makes sense. It just isn't what we're taught, and you have to bring your children up questioning authority, questioning the things that are dominant paradigm. So that's what I do. That's why I'm agent provocateur. Why? I
Mm,
know that the food gurus don't like what I say. I know the biochemists hate what I say because it
mm,
destroys their beliefs and it destroys their sales funnels. I don't care about that. I'm not in this
yes.
business for sales funnels. You know what I'm in the business of? Is to see guys like you come on a podcast and tell people, yeah, my people eat shit. And guess what? They do okay. That's the same story I told about the guy that won all the gold medals from Jamaica, right? He told everybody on TV after he won the gold medals. They asked him, "What did you eat?" He goes, "Yeah, I trained and I ate chicken McNuggets." And they couldn't believe it when he said it. Or the better one, because I like to hit all these. Michael Phelps. No, they asked him, they found out that he was smoking weed, when he was training and he won all the gold medals. So you got to start to ask yourself, hey, what is it that we all believe that keeps blocking us from nature's truth? And what I would tell you, and what I hope the audience is getting from our conversation, is that I want you
Mm,
to be a really keen observer of animals in nature, because you look at animals in nature, you can see that we are zoo animals. We are not like the animals.
yeah.
And when you understand how we're not like the animals and see all the mistakes we make, then you begin to understand why we sculpt different morphology, why we sculpt different IQ, why there's such a wide range in the human race of people with all these different traits. Why? Because we all make mistakes breaking nature's laws. And we do it in different ways. Like the zip code that you're in, the zip code I am, we do it differently. But this actually is what determines the variation of what we see, the traits that we see. So this whole idea about Darwinism and neo-Darwinism, that the gene was the most important thing, is bullshit. And look, there's
Mm,
even a book out now that's challenging that. I always post it on Twitter all the time. It's time that we need to stop blaming genes for everything. It's the truth. I mean, we have known literally for 120 years that mitochondria are the key. And when you really parse it out, like the continent that you were just talking about, Africa, I ask this question all the time. I even asked this question to Michael Levin and never got a fundamental answer because he tells everybody EMF doesn't have any role in biology. I said, well, tell me, how do we get mitochondrial haplotypes? Because mitochondrial haplotypes are paying attention to the EMF changes in Africa, in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, even in Antarctica. And when you understand that those haplotypes got sculpted by the changes in the zip code, what is it paying attention to? It's paying attention to light dark cycles. And you know that the light cycle, say in Algeria, is different than the light cycle in Cape Town. The light cycle
Mm.
in Peru is different than the one in El Salvador. It's certainly different than the United States and Northern Europe. And you start to go, wow, this story is actually time stamped into our biology in our mitochondrial haplotype. Notice I didn't say the nuclear haplotype because there is none. Turns out it's the mitochondria that has this haplotype variation. And why is that the case? Because it's the thing that makes the most light in us. And that's what sculpts the genome. The genome is then just a lens. That's all it is.
I see. Yeah. For all people watching, I really suggest you to rewatch this podcast so to understand most of the points Dr. Jack Cruz is making. So coming to my next questions. So compared to when my circadian rhythm was bad, because it was very bad. I used to wake up at 6 p.m. and sleep very late in the morning, not even at night. It was completely upside down. And the reason was because of technology addiction and blue light exposure, excessive blue light exposure. So the thing that I noticed most improved was that I feel much better and I have a better perception of time. I have a better perception of time throughout the day and months, and I feel like I'm actually spending my time very well, and my time is longer. I don't know how to explain that, but I mean, could you actually? Is there a link between time perception and circadian biology and
Yeah,
the way we age and
yeah, of
as time
course.
speeds?
Of course. I mean, everybody again who listens to this podcast will probably smile when I'm giving you the analogy. It's probably not a good one for you where you are, but I'll just say you think about a holiday that like children look forward to. In the United States, it's Christmas, right?
Yes.
It's it seems like for children, Christmas never comes. Takes
Mm,
forever. For adults, they feel like it comes right away because they have to buy more stuff and it's that perception is really crazy. And you always see children say, "Are we there yet? Are we there?" It's like time for them has been dilated. Why is that? Well, it's because they have more water in their system. Why don't human adults have that? When a baby is born, 90% water. When you're my age, you're about 55% water. Turns out,
mm,
what's the interaction between light and water? Light turns water into an electromagnetic capacitor. Now, remember all the circadian clock genes that you talked about. Those genes are surrounded by water. They're also linked to the light. So let's just take one of the clock genes out that you've probably heard about. It's called cryptochrome, CRY. What affects it tremendously? Infrared A light. Now I know you know that because it turns on and regenerates heme proteins in your body. So what do heme proteins do fundamentally? One of the heme proteins in your inner mitochondrial membrane is called cytochrome C oxidase. It makes water, and it makes that deuterium depleted water. You think that has anything to do with how effective the cryptochrome gene works? Oh, you damn right it does. Then let's talk about the other side of the equation, like from the biochemistry stuff that you had talked about earlier. People know about NAD positive. They also know about ATP. People know NAD is the beginning part of the mitochondrial membrane, and ATP is made at the end. Well, what do those two things funnel down to? They funnel down to something in biochemistry called the AMPK pathway. You don't have to remember all this, but do you know what it also does? It actually increases the periodicity of the CRY gene as well. So, in other words, I just described to you three different ways that the CRY gene is affected by light. So, you
mm,
increase the periodicity. What did I tell you earlier about peer one and peer two? What links to that? This is the most amazing part of the story. That's the hypoxia inducible factor 1 alpha. So if you have the inappropriate amount of oxygen in your system, the periodicity of those two clock genes are off. Then what's the real big one? The big one that you probably heard about is mTOR. mTOR is kind of looked at like a garbage pail where all the epigenetic findings seem to fall down indirectly. These are
Mm,
things that are like tied to gluconeogenesis, mitochondrial biogenesis, oxidative phosphorylation from the TCA cycle, amino acid turnover, lipogenesis, bile acid synthesis, all the things that you guys know. And then what is mTOR effectively doing? It's measuring metabolic flux. Why is it doing that? To create UPE signals. So it's looking for change in glucose, change in ATP, change in AMP, change in oxygen, change in glucocorticoids, change in catecholamines, everything. So how does it really act? mTOR sends signals to both NAD and SIRT1, and you know where it feeds back? To the two major circadian clock genes, clock and BMAL1. So what does it do? It makes your clock tick more accurately. So the question you asked me, Jack, when I live more in nature, I seem to have a better appreciation of time than, say, some of the older people that are around me that don't do the things that I do. So what did I just describe to you? Because you're tapped to nature and you're getting UVA light, which is 380 nanometer light, which stimulates mTOR, and you get infrared A light, you just got the light that actually makes the clock in you run better, more accurately. So when you have a clock that runs better, more accurately, you have an experience that you have more time. And
mm,
that's then you have the perception that you have more time. And that's also the reason that your grandfather has the perception that he feels like holidays come too fast or he has to pay his employees too quick because 2 weeks comes all the time. And, it's kind of a funny thing when you point out to people that every single circadian clock gene in humans is surrounded by deuterium diluted water. So when you have less water, that's why time perception changes. And this is the reason why children have a different perception. But the really interesting point you brought up is you're not a baby and you're not an old man. But you have noticed that when you've been more connected with nature, you feel like you have a better relationship with time. I think you just proved my point that you can modify your perception of reality when you begin to understand how the timing, oxygen levels, and light tie to how you perceive time. And what I just
mm.
described to you also is another counterintuitive thing, something that Albert Einstein was popped for. He fundamentally told everybody that time is not a real thing. Well, didn't I just tell you how we create time? Notice that it wasn't, it was from what? Oxygen, light, and clock genes. And you start to go, shit.
Mm,
This is actually goes straight back to physics. Why? Because what does physics say? Quantum mechanics. What did Newton tell us 500 years ago? Newton told us that time is absolute, right? What did
yes,
Einstein tell us in 1905? Time's
relative.
well, it's relative. Everything is relative.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? That means if something is relative, that means something actually has to control it. What
Mm,
controls it? Light, darkness, and temperature. That's why circadian clock mechanism is that important. So what did I just do for you? I brought you to the circle of life, didn't I? I just showed you
yeah.
that you may not have ever understood, but what I did is use first principle thinking to take you back, to put it all together so you can see it for yourself from the 100,000-foot view and go, wow, like this is something that I can actually use in my life. So when Jack talks about going to see the sunrise, what is he
Mm,
telling me? He wants me to go make sure that I'm always getting UVA and infrared A light so that I can reset the default settings that I came out of the vagina with. In other words,
mm,
make my clock really tick properly so that I can do the things that I need to do, not only to build my brain, but also keep my morphology, to keep my health, to keep my health span, to live a long life so I can be 90, 100, 10 years old, even if I eat lentils, rice, and figs, because you can do that. You
mm.
absolutely can do that. We know from first principles that you can do that. The key is understanding how to do that.
Yeah, completely makes sense actually. Yes, and people that again watch this video, they could try it themselves compared to when you were in COVID and you could not go outside. You felt like time was passing super fast because the routine was there, and you also were not connected to nature. You were not seeing the sunrise. You were not, you're not getting no
And
no
who
sun
and
at
who
all.
control and who controlled all that?
Yes, of course,
in
the
power.
globalists and yeah,
So they kept you away from being in nature. And what were they trying to do? See, in other words, you just proved my point in another way. See, what we're
yeah,
doing here is we're giving people the fractals. There's a reason why Dr. Fauci kept you off the beach, kept you in your house, wouldn't let you talk to other people. Why? Because they
why?
were looking to unwind all these things in you so they could control you, to make you an economic slave.
Uh, mm,
That is the goal of the globalists. That is the goal of big pharma. That is the goal of the bankers globally. They want to take us back to the way the world was 1,000 years ago in medievalism, when medievalism and feudalism
mm,
and was imperialism. And your continent has been destroyed by this idea of British imperialism, by French imperialism, by Dutch imperialism.
yes,
They want to go back to that system. And that is the whole point of understanding why you really need to be a first principle thinker and ask me some of the questions you did, because I believe the only way we unravel this whole thing is to actually improve people's wisdom and their IQ, to improve
mm,
people's morphology so they can fight back against what these people are trying to do. And I don't think people see how all these things connect. Like I've been to some Bitcoin conferences in Prague, and I told people about health and wealth and how they're fundamentally tied together. And I will tell you,
yeah,
my opinion, this conversation that you and I have had over probably the last hour is probably the best example that I can point to that I've done that proves that to be axiomatically true. And I gave you the science fully behind it and why it happens. But for you, this has been an exploration. And I want to talk about the biology, Jack. I want to talk about this, but realize what you just did. You brought the physics and the biologic discussion straight to the modern current events. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. Hopefully, that will wake a lot of people up and say, maybe I need to start questioning everything they tell us to do, because maybe everything they tell us to do is for their benefit, not for ours.
yes. And we brought it up already, and we'll continue talking about it because I wanted to ask you actually a question about. So I actually did not get.
So this part has to be censored, unfortunately. If we discuss it, it's gonna get the whole channel deleted and censored. I will put the whole part in my Patreon. You can just get behind the paywall, get the visitor tier. It's very cheap, like $5. I'm sorry for everyone, but we cannot discuss this on YouTube especially. It will get the whole channel deleted.
I think people read into my tweets sometimes and they say that, but I think that's because they're not members, they're not reading my work, they're not
Yes,
hearing what I'm
yes.
telling people. And I think unfortunately I would like to uncloak everything that I'm doing, but if I did, I would probably run into a lot of problems both with politicians and also
Mm,
state medical boards, kind of like Mary Talley Bowden did. And at this point I could care less about the state medical boards because I'm effectively done with medicine anyway. I'm not planning on going back anymore. I did
mm,
my duty to figure out what was going on. I told the world what I found. Um, and I did that in podcast. I told everybody. I tried to do the best I could with the politicians in the United States. And I'll be honest with you, um, not that I trusted them, but they let us all down. They caused it. They allowed it to go on, and they're not punishing the people that did it.
yeah, you're basically talking about Kennedy. Yeah.
Well, not only Kennedy, but I will tell you, I had a lot of hope that Trump was
Mm,
going to
Trump.
unleash this.
Yeah.
But when Trump put in an AG, Attorney General, and his chief of staff, who both work for Pfizer and both
Mm,
are in big pharma, I knew right away, forget it, man. The casino deck is stacked. Bobby Kennedy is not going to be able to do anything because this was like they're pouring concrete right around Bobby Kennedy. What
mm.
can he do? He can't do
Makes
anything.
sense. Yeah, you can't do anything. But thank you very much for your time, and your work is absolutely amazing. I will put all the links of your Patreon and every single social that you have, Twitter as well. Thank you very much for the work you're doing for humanity. Thank you very much, Dr.
No
Jacobs.
problem. And thanks for this podcast. I actually really enjoyed this one. It was probably one of my favorite ones I've done.
Thank you very much.